Last Sunday morning, we looked at a lesson from 1 Kings chapter 17, and I invite you to turn to 1 Kings 17 because we're going to look at a few more points from this particular text. Jesus said during his ministry, "Were there not many widows in Israel? Yet Elijah was sent to Zarephath," to this widow that was there in this place that was not Israel, in this place that was Gentile country. And it's an amazing and remarkable story as we begin to digest and dissect and pull the truths from it. This past week, our midweek Bible School, Fall Fest, VBS, whatever you want to call it, 2020 alternative to Vacation Bible School, focused on this particular story in 1 Kings 17, this incident in Elijah's life. Last Sunday morning, we looked at this text by examining the first few verses of it, but tonight we are going to further look at this text and examine the entirety of the chapter. And just to remind you of the things that we pointed out last week, beginning in verse 1, we said that there are some unlikely things we find in this chapter. In fact, this lesson is about God choosing and using the most unlikely. And God does that often, and we're trying to make application of that as we move throughout the text itself. Before we actually remind ourselves of last week's lesson, let's read the text. And because we're going to look at the entire chapter, let's just read the chapter again. Beginning at verse 1, "Then Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word." And we learned that that's a period of 3.5 years in its totality. Verse 2, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, and he went and stayed by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up. Remember, there is a drought. There is no rain. And the brook dries up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there." This is Gentile territory. "See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink." And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." So she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin, and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me. And afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the Lord sends rain on the earth." So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. And the bin of flour was not used up, nor the jar of oil run dry, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Elijah. Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, And his sickness was so serious, so severe, that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin in remembrance and to kill my son?" And he said to her, "Give me your son." So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. And he cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?" And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now, by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." Some remarkable things from this text as we think about the very many unlikelies and how God chooses and uses the most unlikely for his purposes. Last Sunday morning, we pointed out these 3 things. Number 1, there's an unlikely person, that being Elijah himself. He just kind of comes out of nowhere in this chapter. There's no grand announcement about him, and bam, he's on the scene. And James chapter 5 tells us that he was just an ordinary man like you and me. He was a man of just normal creative power by God, just like you and me. Obviously, he had different abilities than you and I do from the supernatural standpoint, but he was just an ordinary man. Number 2, we talked about the unlikely prayer. If Elijah was trying to help these people, why would he pray for a drought? Why would he pray for a drought that we understand lasted for 3.5 years? Well, a lot of the answer to that is understood in it was trying to make probably the motive behind that was making Baal look powerless, because Baal was unable to give the rain. Baal was unable to give the provision that these people who worship Baal asked him for. And Baal was supposed to be a god, lowercase g, of substance, and a god of fertility, and a god of provision like that, and he simply could not. And so Elijah prayed this unlikely prayer to show the people, so that the people might see that their so-called God was actually powerless. Third, we also saw that there was an unlikely place. Actually, 2 unlikely places when you look at the text, because God sends him first to the wilderness, where there's no one, and no way apparently for Elijah to even provide for himself. And then God sends him to Gentile territory. Ironically, God sends him to a place that says belongs to the region of Sidon, which is Jezebel's homeland. And God hides Elijah in that place, basically in plain sight from his greatest enemy. Well, those are 3 unlikelies. Here, as we spend a few minutes together tonight, let's think about 3 or 4 more. And just to keep with the numbering that we have, this would be the 4th from the text. The 4th unlikely that God chooses and uses is the unlikely provider. The unlikely provider. Now, I realize that if you were in this class, if you were in this room, in this auditorium, Wednesday at 7 o'clock, that for the benefit of our many guests who were here, who were parents of the children that were part of our VBS, and for the small handful of Mastin Lake people who were not some way participating in VBS, that we studied this text on Wednesday night. And the 3 or 4 points, the 3 or 4 more points that we're going to draw out of this text, we covered those on Wednesday night. We will do that again. So if you were here on Wednesday night, then, and if you're thinking, this sounds familiar to me, it's because it probably is. Because if you were in this room, you heard some of this on Wednesday. but I have Bible precedents for this. Galatians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul wrote to the people in the churches of Galatia, "As I said unto you before, so say I now again." And so you're going to get to hear this a second time and be blessed by it, I hope, a second time, or maybe a first time if you weren't blessed the first time in that respect. But as we look at the text, there is an unlikely provider. In fact, really, there are two unlikely providers in the text. There are the ravens, and then there's the widow. Two very unlikely providers. Elijah is sent out to a place in the wilderness where there is no population, apparently. There are no restaurants. There's no way Elijah can actually provide for himself out there. And God says, "See, I have commanded the ravens that they will come to you and that they will provide for you." Now, there are people who have tried to explain the supernatural element of this away. In fact, when we began doing translating work, and I know very little, almost nothing about original Hebrew of the Old Testament, but it's my understanding that many of the manuscripts of the original Hebrew, that we find this in the copies of those manuscripts, that in many cases the vowel points, the vowels are not in the words. And so it has to combine the knowledge of context and Hebrew words into translating into another English to know what are the proper vowels to insert to make the proper word to fit the context. And, there are English words like you can put a string of consonants together, and you might could put in more than one vowel and get different words. Just a very simplistic illustration of that. Suppose we take the consonants FT. Well, you can put two E's there and you get feet. You can put two O's there, you get foot. Now, those are related words to one another, but you can see how different vowels make different words in a sense. And you can branch that out a little further, and between that F and T, you can put an EA, and you can get feet. Not feet like these things, but a feat, an accomplishment. And on you can go thinking of how that works. And context in the Hebrew determines what vowels need to go in between those consonants to form the correct words. I've given you all that background, not to make us all Hebraist or anything, but the people who try to explain away this. In most of our English translations, it says ravens. There is a possibility. It's not made up. It's not conjecture. There is a possibility that if different Hebrew vowels were put in the words between those Hebrew consonants in the manuscript, the Hebrew manuscript, you could come up with the word Arabs. And those people who try to explain away the miraculous dynamic here, the miraculous event of the ravens feeding Elijah twice a day, say it doesn't mean that birds were commanded by God to bring anything to Elijah. It just means that some Arabs who lived in the area twice a day, they provided for him. Well, from a practical standpoint, that's highly unlikely, even though the people of that culture in that day and time were known for their hospitality. That hospitality primarily was extended when you came to their house. It's not often that they brought the food to you at an inconvenience to them when you're out in the middle of the wilderness beside a brook. But even if it was the case that they would do that, why explain away the supernatural dynamic in the middle of a story, an incident filled with other supernatural events? And if God can make animals come in pairs to Noah on the ark prior to the flood, if God can make a donkey talk to Balaam, and if God, the Son of God, Jesus, can know about a fish in a body of water where Peter was going to go cast his rod, cast his net, and that fish had the exact change in its mouth to pay the temple tax for Peter and for Jesus, if God could know and do all those things, then I have no doubt here that ravens could bring food to Elijah twice a day. There is no need for us to explain away the miraculous dynamic or the miraculous element here. It is an unlikely provider. Ravens are often known not for bringing food, but for scavenging food. And yet, God chooses and uses the most unlikely. But notice He also used this widow. And we learn that this widow was poor, without enough food to last her till tomorrow, and she had nothing. And she was so despondent and so desperate, she had given up hope of living much longer. Now, I got to admit, this is the last person that I would turn to for help. No reflection on her, no lack of sympathy or compassion for her, but this is the last person that I would turn to. Number one, she wasn't even one of God's people. She wasn't an Israelite. She wasn't one of the chosen nation. She wasn't even a member of one of the unfaithful tribes in the northern kingdom. She was a Gentile. She had a pagan background. She was too poor to even feed herself or her child. Why would I possibly turn to her? And yet God chooses and uses the most unlikely. Sometimes that person that we think could never help us, could never bless us, is the very one. And you know what? Sometimes we think we are that person. Sometimes I think I am the last person that could help. I am the last person that could bless. I am the last person that could provide for someone else in need. And I think it's me. I'm the last person. And guess what God does to me? He puts me in a position where I am the person. And I do help. Poverty. How desperate this woman was. How dark this must have been for her. I've been reading a book lately by an Alabama author named Rick Bragg. Rick Bragg grew up in Calhoun County, Alabama, which is where Jacksonville, Alabama is. And he's written a book, he's written several books actually, but one of his most recent books is a background into his great-grandparents, grandparents, and even his own mother, into how they lived and they functioned in poverty, and how they raised children and families in difficulty. It's partially a cookbook. You never, again, God chooses the most unlikely sometimes, because you never think I'd be reading a cookbook. And I doubt I'll be whipping out too many recipes from it, just to be honest with you. You know, I hadn't found Fruit Loops in it yet. But in part of the book, he talks about his grandparents and the poverty they faced. And I want to read you just a little excerpt from the book to give us maybe a little better idea of this woman in 1 Kings 17. I suppose at any given time, almost every one of us in here could say, we haven't had enough money to make ends meet, or we've been poor in a sense, or we've not had enough money maybe to live like we wanted to live, or we haven't been able to buy a lot of new clothes, or we haven't been able to buy anything really nice, and maybe sometimes we haven't even had enough to feed everybody adequately. But what about real poverty? Real hunger. The year was 1934, Mr. Bragg writes. His grandmother and grandfather were parents to 4 children. And because of some dishonest dealings of his grandfather, he was in jail at this time for about a year. And Mr. Bragg writes about his grandmother, a lady named Ava Bundrum. And of Ava Bundrum, he writes, 1934 seemed more like a legend than anything else. My brother Sam, who is older and whose memory is better than mine, remembers sitting with my uncles and aunts and their kin who were just little children at the time in 1934, listening to them tell what it was like to be hungry, not just late for supper, but hungry. What he remembers most was the old fear in their voices and how now it seemed, even after such much time had passed, so very near. Whole careers had passed. Mortgages had been paid. Children raised. A little money saved in the bank. But even though they were sitting in a warm house far and safe away at a table that sagged with food, it seemed just outside the door. They said they'd walk through a cornfield and pick through the stalks on the ground. They'd gather the cotton that didn't open and prize it out and throw the husk in the fire and sell just the least little bit of cotton back to the people or try to do it. The relatives who had a little extra help when they could, they gave them a limp sack of flour or meal, or some end pieces of bacon and a few potatoes or a sack of okra. Ava became farm labor in a time when people were being told not to grow cotton in the first place. There was no market, no need. She became a house servant for people who could barely pay their own bills and paid her in pocket change. She took in sewing and made quilts to sell till there were no scraps or rags left to piece together from. In the summer, she hired out to chop cotton for the few farmers who put it in the ground. In September, she hired out again to pick it, but it was never enough. The boys tried to be fishermen and hunters like their daddy, but they failed. They were just too small, all of them, to be much help then, but they dragged sacks behind their mother when the season came. It was hard times for everyone, of course, harder with a man in jail, which was like being a widow till parole came through. The old people sang about deliverance across the roads, but Ava did not have much hope left anymore. Things had been so bad for so long, it seemed a thing just to survive, but just the way it would always be. The songs Ava sang that had always been an escape, a way to lift her spirits, now were a prayer. Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears while we all sup sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times, come again no more. Hard times, hunger, starvation, widowhood. Mr. Bragg writes that when his grandfather was arrested and taken into custody, and he had to leave his wife and those 4 small children behind for those many months, that his wife, Ava, that I just read to you about, did not tell him there was only a small handful of flour in the kitchen, a few spices, a couple of potatoes, and not one single piece of money. Not one dime. That is who God sent Elijah to in 1 Kings 17. That's the last person that I would have thought would have been able to help anyone. She couldn't even help herself. And when God calls on you and me and presents the opportunities to you and me to be that least likely person, let's do it with all our might. Let's be the unlikely provider. Number 5, the unlikely provision. The unlikely provision itself. the ravens who brought the food every day to Elijah. I can't even train a dog to sit. And ravens were bringing food to Elijah twice a day. I wonder if he named any of them, and he looked forward to when they were coming. But all of this was proof that God had an endless supply of resources, that only He could do this. You send a man to a widow who only had enough food to make a little bit so that she and her son could eat it and then die in their sleep, they hoped. But the provision kept coming. The ravens kept coming. The flour bin did not empty. The jar of oil did not empty. And the food kept coming every day. Two things that you notice from our text. Notice that when this widow explains to Elijah her predicament and her plight, that Elijah's response to her, and no doubt this is directly from God, do not fear. Do not fear. And something else that we learn from this, that we need to put God's business above even our own comfort sometimes. Because Elijah said, bring me some water. Well, she was going to comply with that. And then when he said, bring me a morsel of food, bring me a cake of bread, bring me something to eat, and she explained how bad things were, notice what Elijah said. Well, go and make the cake of bread, go and make the food, but give me some first. And you're thinking, Elijah, how heartless could a man be? Just stick the knife in her back and twist it, okay? I mean, how cruel, how cold, how callous. He was testing her faith. God was testing her faith. But it was also proof of what? There are times when we think about unlikely provision. There are times when I need to put the will of God first, even above my own comfort and my own logic. And when we do, we are blessed. And this widow was blessed because she was willing to do this very thing. Be reminded of the manna that God sent to the children of Israel in Exodus for 40 years. He fed hundreds of thousands of people every single day of every single week of every single month of every single year for 40 years. Millions and millions of meals. No one went hungry. An unlikely provision, yes, but God provided it. Be reminded of another widow in 2 Kings chapter 4 with another prophet named Elisha, who was supernaturally provided oil to sell to pay a debt she had incurred. Be reminded during the ministry of Jesus that He fed 5,000 hungry people, that on another occasion He fed 4,000 hungry people. And be reminded of all these unlikely provisions. And if you would, look at John 6 for just a moment, when Jesus had finished feeding the 5,000 people, and He speaks with them the next day. And in John 6, Jesus makes the application of the unlikely provision. In fact, after Jesus finishes speaking the words that we're about to read, in verse 60, some of the disciples call this a hard saying. What are they verbalizing? They're saying, this is unlikely. This is an unlikely saying. This is a hard saying. Jesus said in John chapter 6, the discussion beginning in verse 41, the Jews complained about Him because He said, I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that He says, I have come down from heaven? Jesus therefore answered and said, do not murmur among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent Him draws him, and I will raise him at the last day. As it is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except he who is from God, he has seen the Father. Most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. I am, here's the unlikely provision, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. A very unlikely provision, but the Son of God gave it. And with it, all mankind has been blessed. Number 6, an unlikely possibility. As you look toward the end of 1 Kings 17, you learn that after all this widow has been through and now survived, what happens? Her son dies. I gather from the text that he was somewhat on the younger end of the spectrum, because she held him in his arms. Of course, what mother wouldn't, no matter the age? But Elijah took him, Elijah carried him back and presented him to her. In some translations, he's called the lad. And so I gather that while he may not be, 18 months old, that he's not a full-grown adult either. And the boy dies. There's no breath in him. Elijah prays for his soul to be restored to him. Now the widow has given up all hope. She's distraught. She's filled with the raw pain and emotion of all that she has been through. And now her son has died. And she speaks to Elijah and says, "Why have you come here? Why have you let this happen to me? Is it about my sin and you've killed my son?" The emotions are raw. They're volatile. Her pain is speaking. And the unlikely possibility here is what? That her son would ever come to life again. And yet, when we read the story, what happens? Elijah, through prayer, God responds, and the life of the child is restored. This is the first resurrection you read about in the Bible. There will be some more to follow, and of course the great crescendo is the resurrection of Jesus. But this is the first resurrection that you actually read about in the Bible. Now we learn from Hebrews 11 that Abraham thought that if he actually killed his son Isaac, that God could bring him back to life again. What incredible faith that must have been for Abraham to envision and think about that, because there had been no resurrection from the dead prior to this. And even on that occasion, there still was not one. Literally. But here, literally. The unlikely possibility is what? It had never happened before. There have been a lot of supernatural events connected with the people of God and the prophets of God. But they'd never done this. They had healed the sick. They had brought back from the point of death those who seemed to be dying because of severe health issues. But no one had ever died and been brought back to life until now. And this unlikely possibility, we see this widow had, in essence, given Elijah life, and he will return it back to her and let her have the life of her son once again, because those who do God's will are always blessed. And again, there are people who are skeptical of the Scriptures who will tell us that a resurrection at the last day is highly unlikely. And they will take chapters in the Bible like 1 Corinthians 15, They will take words like what Jesus said that we just read a few moments ago in John chapter 6 about raising people up at the last day. And they'll say that all of this is just a fairy tale. All of this is fiction. All of this is just made up by the imagination of men. And they'll say that it's very unlikely, if not impossible. And yet we know by faith this unlikely possibility is an absolute possibility, the resurrection. Seventh and final in our text is an unlikely proclamation. Look at the last verse of the chapter. In the last verse of the chapter, after the widow has seen these things, the miraculous provision of food, the restoration of life to her son, she makes this statement: "Now by this I know that you are the man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." Now remember, she was not an Israelite. She was a Sidonian. She grew up in pagan country, probably had some kind of pagan background. In fact, when you go back earlier in the chapter, in verse 12, when Elijah first meets the widow, she says to him, "As the Lord your God lives." She doesn't even identify with God. She says, He's your God, as the Lord your God lives. But now, as we culminate in this story and we come to this end, the unlikely proclamation is what? I know that all the things that you say are true because you are really, actually, the man of God. She's saying that God really exists, and that everything that you say and every word that you say from God is what? Truth. She was identifying now with God and the words of God from the man of God. You know, you would have thought this was a very unlikely proclamation, but now that the darkness had lifted, now that she had seen the proof of God, she believed. Kind of like Martha, John 11. And when Jesus came, another resurrection, by the way, you read about in the Bible of Lazarus. When Jesus came, you know, he said, your brother will live. And she said, oh, I know he'll live at the last day, you know, when God will raise him up. And she goes on in John 11 to make the proclamation when Jesus asks her, when Jesus makes the statement to her and he kind of lays it in her lap, I am that resurrection. I am the life. And those who believe in me, they will never die. And he says to Martha, do you believe this? Martha, in her grief, in her pain, in her hurt, remember the first thing she said to Jesus when she saw him was, if you had been here, this wouldn't never happen. And the most unlikely thing, the last thing you thought she would have said, is the very next thing she says after Jesus kind of lays it in her lap. She says, I know that you are the Christ. I know that you're the Lord. I know. This woman, and at least Martha, we can give credit, you know, she was an Israelite. She had the background. She loved Jesus and had heard him speak. This woman, she had very little of that same kind of background. But it's really not that unlikely, is it? In view of all that she now knew. And she says all that she now knew was what? Truth. It's all the truth. And she says, I now know the truth. And today, some will still reject the truth. Some will still reject Jesus. Some will still reject the spokesman for God, prophets, apostles, even Jesus himself. And they say this is highly unlikely. And they will proclaim that it's all just, once again, a made-up invention of men. What about me? I can't control the thoughts of everyone. I can't determine the faith and the heart and reaction of everyone, but I can mine. What about me? I've seen by faith. I've heard by faith. Do I now know Am I absolutely certain it's the truth? Is that my proclamation? Is that my heart's explanation for how great God is? Is that where it will lead me? You may think that you're the most unlikely person to become a child of God. You may think that you're the most unlikely person to serve God in the capacities that you might be called upon. But God is choosing, and He wants to use you. Will you let Him? Will you walk with Him faithfully? Will you let Him choose you, use you? Come tonight as we stand and we sing.